Welcome back. If you're ready, I'm going to start the session. Here, and then and we can consult with Mehmet from Alıç of localization. They will talk about the importance of localization in games, and they will talk about localization strategy that will allow participants to make most of the market. Welcome back. You can start. Could you bring on the presentation? Good afternoon, everybody. As the presentation is loading up, I'll make the introduction now that everybody is getting seated. You. So first of all, I'd like to thank everybody for their participation. Before I start my speech, I will first make a reference to my colleagues who are interpreters who are making sure that our speakers monitoring another language are engaged and involved in localization. So each and every game that is being developed should have a life in other languages, in other parts of the world. And the markets that they venture into, they should position themselves accordingly, and they should be marketed according to those markets. So therefore, localization is quite important for us. And I will talk about PILT, which is a text phrase in this industry, and every game developer should actually understand this name, even at the stage of developing it. And developing it, they have a look at PILT. So when a game starts being developed, there comes to a stage where translation, localization, globalization, and global marketing will be needed. As we all know, the offered English, but in other markets, in other languages, in other parts of the world, meeting it will be quite important there. So for many publishers, and there are many companies that only focus on translation, but when they take us, we recommend the following: any geography that you went to and you don't want to get lost in it, you should always have a particular slide in your mind. And the 13, 10, 5, 2 languages can be translated, but you should forget the an ecosystem. Because anywhere you go, the sales and taxation and marketing, in-country support and demand should just like that you need to take into account, and why you need to have it like your mind as well. And translation is never confined to literary translation. And then you translate a game, the game should definitely have a response to it. So from Turkish into English or from other languages, Chinese, or even Brazilian, all the subsegments you will need to take into account challenges. And I have focused on globalization, my MA studies, so I will talk about that. This is quite an important aspect actually. Once a day, partly marketed, developers tend to say, I'm going to put this game translated, so I'm going to not translated into Chinese, Russian, German, or Swedish, but globalization or simplification, let's say. How is your game conducive, viable for globalization? For example, when you put a space, a language that is unintelligible, will your characters know that, for example, when you want to many games get lost in the market, lost in translation. 2 months ago, in Chinese, or I mean, we were translating actually. All the developers that we worked with said that, well, this game would be great for the Chinese market. This is designed for the Chinese market, but how much uh, this game is prepared for, how much ready is that? So we need to come from points where we feel a bit challenged. You may come up with a great car, but it won't really run when you put oil. So it is how it really works, because normally the mistakes that you make in the culture, in the destination culture, target culture, it gets lost in terms of software. So this is the stage where it gets lost. And it is the fact that the game goes through localization, internationalization, adaptation, and then some joint work being conducted. So after that, the translation is not work. Otherwise, it's only a translation, word for word, and then you get feedback as well. I can't understand the button, the character is not really work well, or you see an and you don't understand the space, or it is unintelligible from left to right. Imagine that you are reading from the end to the beginning, so it is going to be the case for the Arabic market as well. But you can take simple steps to solve this problem. And the sales aspect of it, sales dimension of it, I'd like to start by saying the following. You may have a great product and may have a great trust in it, but by the way, I'm also interested. I play the guitar. It may write the greatest song in the world, but you need the target group. So it won't really matter how great your song is if you don't have a target group. So this is something that we emphasize a lot while working with development. Yes, we deliver a lot of efforts on the side of product development, but what about marketing? I'm talking about indie. Have budget here and not distribute the budget properly when you invest your resources in product development. You cannot really offer it to a large audience, and then you don't have the budget for it. That's why you can't offer it to large audience. So this is one of the greatest world come up with highest return. And we see this analysis, which among the top 100 studies from Steve's, so will understand the crises and the opportunities that generated when we top 100 games from Steve. The least localized games are mostly localized in 5 or 6 languages, and have different languages for your games, but it is not only important enough to focus on the intelligibility of that. People create bonds with the target audience, because some games may have a lot of bugs, for example, but they will translate their game into Turkish, so we have this bond with them. So this had a lot of reverberations across the globe, but the fact that it had a lot of bugs, it didn't really matter a lot for the Turkish market, because investments didn't also made. So that's why they have a different place for us. When did we want to it, you may have seen it, the Turkish localization of that. There is a translation crisis. There was a translation crisis about Mustafa Kemal's phrase about future in the skies. So even on the trees, first they have some bugs, and the bugs are more fixed in the second or third release. But I, as a Turkish community, I don't think we are tolerant. That's why community relation is a quite risky aspect of our work. Yes, the marketing without any budget allocated for marketing or the community translate. If you translate it with the community, it means that you take risks into account. So although mistakes made within the game, they can't be dismissed and disregarded, but the fact that there is a mistake in the language side of it may result in game not being purchased, or it may result in different prices. So the reports, let's look at reports. We have two reports, top 100, but one is the RPG game and the other is strategy. And let's have a look at we have 6 of them be localized in Turkish and 9 of them not localized in Turkish. And all and our game developers, when you do it, as it is, if it is a playing game, but mostly not localized, but in this case, it's okay for us to not localize it. But we are talking about peer competition, and the way to differentiate yourself for the Turkish market is to localize it, which the road not so frequently taken. So this is something that you can do for the Turkish market. As for the strategy, 8 of them have been the top 100 games, and a huge percentage of them have been localized. You may be a foreign developer who is interested in the Turkish market, and it shows the following. For survival in this particular market, we definitely need to localize it in Turkish. So if it's not a very popular game, or if your game is not really awaited with great hype, you need to proceed with localization. So again, surviving in the market or not surviving in the market will be defined by the extent to which it was localized. And probably Bekir will talk about this detail, but I will touch upon the following. Depends which market you like to go to and how your game is compliant with the dynamics of the market, and then the rankings of localization for your game. We have 3 localization types. The first is box and dock documentation and localization. This is on the side of consoles, and it was something that we saw on the side in the past. Partial localization is another category of localization. The UI, for example, is localized there, and the third is full localization. So translate the narrative of the game. So you need to put yourself accordingly. So if you don't have the budget for full localization, the first recommendation is to have localization on Steam page. Your shown it, and it is understandable that the fact that you are on Steam page, your native tongue will that will not understand you, but your game should be understood so that the potential of the players should be your customers. So in the first phase, you need to localize your game in the markets that you'd like to go to, or you are planning to have it localized in 10 languages. If you are 100% sure of that, you definitely specify it on your Steam page. You can do it on the page, and you can create it. You want to upgrade, you may localize it at certain stages, but you specify it so that people know that they will have localized versions, and it's quite important. And yes, I'd like to add on to what you said. In localized game, we had the 3 native tongues, and we then localized it in languages or indigenous languages. So in languages, you needed to market it in the 15 languages. So it's not going to be a high cost for you, but in one day, people are going to be visiting those languages, and for you to understand quick time the target audience we're working with, we've seen a great increase in the wish list, because from Indian to many other indigenous languages, people started to understand what kind of game it was and what it promised to users. So that's full explanation. Even before the game is offered on other markets, it brought along its own impact. So they had to wait for 2 years, but in those 2 years, they were there on the same stage, and therefore the players knew the future of the game, and they knew that it was going to be released. So they started playing the game in English, and when their native songs were available, they either made the transition on a good strategy, because the main fact is that as a Turkish player, I always said, well, these games aren't available in Turkish anyways. It's okay for me, I would tend to think. But again, I had this wish to do it in Turkish as well. So this is how the groups work, and once you do it, you game spread across certain regions much faster. So you may go there in a ready session, or you may have to explain yourself to a user group that not really have any idea about you. So you basically message that you are there, you're on the way, but you may basically just come out of there, and it is also difficult for you to convey your message. So localization and time, by the way, the subject matter where I teach at university as well. So coming up with a translation report and the translation classes. And my number one recommendation is as follows. When you develop a game one day, if you are developing a game, first you need to do the positioning very well. You need to have a right market position. And if you don't do it, you will pick the wrong languages and wrong market, and you will end up spending your money in the wrong place. So we saw the impact of that. Is this better right now? The speaker. I think it's better now.
Correct market research teaches us to work with correct teams. So if you don't choose the team, we receive a feedback from our customers or from our friends. Well, we tried to launch our game in this language. We had a good translation. It doesn't matter if you have a translation. What matters is, as I have shown in the GILT table, is the product. If your translation doesn't come to life as a product, it's a investment in vain. If you translate your game to 100 languages, but if it's not understandable in the game, it's a dead investment. It's a simple explanation, really. You see the third stage here. So if you design your game that is ready for localization, the rest is really easy. But if you don't plan your game well, if you plan a complicated game, we receive such mistakes. I played a lot of games during my grad school. I used to take screenshots from every game I played. It became a habit. I noticed this, and I want to show you here. And it says Welbeck passes the ball to Wilshere, but there's a suffix problem in Turkish in the text. So the text is written in English, but the two suffix has 4 different meanings in Turkish. So you have to have different suffixes for different names. So let's say I chose a nickname and I changed my nickname later on, or my friend chose a different nickname. We have to, we are gonna face the same issue. So you have to write your game in a simpler language, or you have to predict the mistakes that's gonna come up later on. And we have to write the game in a simpler manner, or you have to think about the interchangeability of the text of the game. So I know we translated the game to Korean, and they said there are a lot of cultural subjects, and they have had to rewrite the entire text. So they gave us the Korean text. When you think about it, it's a Korean game. If you translated it, it would be Korean, but it wouldn't mean anything to Korean people. So in order to make a playable game, they rewrote the text of the game. As we mentioned at the previous stage, there's an internationalization problem. You see, there's not an I there in Turkish. In our tools, we don't see this in capitalized letters, but your developers just put a line of code in there. If it's a header, it should be capitalized. But if we say this in the tool, we just capitalize the first letter and leave the rest in lowercase. But the Turkish I doesn't have uppercase, so we face such mistakes in translations. This should be Turkish I with capitalized letter, but this I also isn't met by the in-game text. So we face issues in terms of characters, in Turkish characters. The fix is just 2 lines of code, but we have to work on solutions. This is a Latin alphabet. If we had to translate it to Arabic, Russian, Chinese, Korean, we would face 6-7 times more mistakes in the translation, in the localization. One of the worst mistakes examples I saw was in the we translated a game to Chinese, then they wanted the simplified Chinese version, and they wanted the traditional Chinese. Well, as you know, simplified Chinese is the easiest form of Chinese. It's used by 80% of the people. However, the traditional Chinese, we face this mistake. In the traditional Chinese, traditional Chinese is used only in Taiwan and its neighboring regions. It's like Ottoman in Turkey. How many people use Ottoman in Turkey? So they wanted that. And we asked them, why do you want this investment? Because the translators are more expensive. And they said, we think that the demand is going to be more. But we knew the demand wasn't going to be there. So the game didn't need to be localized to traditional Chinese. Also, it's came up with its own issues, because the main difference between traditional and simplified Chinese is the writing form. Simplified is easier. The certain things, certain characters in traditional Chinese doesn't exist in simplified Chinese. So we translated the game to traditional Chinese and we published it, but they said this is still like a simplified version, but the character coding of the game didn't support the traditional Chinese. So they had to receive support from a Chinese coder, because they didn't have the know-how to implement the traditional Chinese in the game. I think, do you really need that many languages? I always ask the developers, do you really need that many languages? So you can spend your money for different markets instead of spending your money for sub-markets of a certain language. In the same vein, one of the most weird translation requests was Dutch. Well, I asked them, what's your audience here? And there were like 100 Dutch players, but was it really worth translating for 100 people? I don't think so. And Dutch people speak English as well as their mother tongue, so you have to choose your investments well. Otherwise, you spend your money in vain. So where does an effective localization process start? The sensitivity in source language is one of the most important factors. When you plan your source text, you have to think about your global audience, your global targets. if you disregard that target, there are going to be problems, major problems. Maybe you will need to rewrite the entire text, so you will have a lot of issues. I saw it in a game. It's a table game. I saw them face this. They had a lot of text and descriptions, but there were a lot of Turkish sayings. But an English speaker said there are no English representatives or English equivalents of these words, so we cannot translate. There is nothing even that coming close to it. So this fancy language couldn't be translated. But instead of translating that language, because it was untranslatable, they rewrote the text in English from scratch. And the Turkish language, the first version of the Turkish text was good for the publisher, but it wasn't helping the translators, because it reduced the playability of the game for the other markets. The second stage is the analysis of the target audience. As Mehmetcan mentioned, this is important to know what to do in what markets, in what languages. Well, it doesn't mean this. You can't plan it later. It doesn't mean you can't plan it later. Of course you can, but you have to, maybe you would need to do retrospective work. You need to build new paths, new connections. You would need to replan the variables. And lastly, Mehmetcan, you can mention this. This is your subject. Is the importance of building a fan base. You have to know what are you doing and why you are doing it. So if your target, why are you localizing your game for your targets? Are you just doing it for money, monetary gains, or do you want to give maximum value to your targets? Or are you trying to make your target have fun in the game? When you localize a game, your next games will have a audience, a waiting audience for your next games, because your audience will say, well, hey, this company made a game and localized it to my market, my language, so it will take the same step again for the new games. So your next games will have an audience in the target markets. Maybe there will be Discord communities, maybe there will be social media activity. So they will be more interested in your game. So your localization efforts will come up as a monetary gain in the long term, and you will also have a community in the target languages. Also, even if you don't have the budget for entire localization of the entire project, you can at least translate or localize the marketing text, because as Mr. Bekir said, English is enough to some certain extent, but having the game localized to people's mother language is extremely important for the target angles. That's it from us. If you have any questions, we can answer them. Hello, thank you very much for your speech. You know, Bethesda, Microsoft, Rockstar Games, Electronic Arts, they are major players. They don't have any budget issues, but they don't really localize their games to a lot of countries because it doesn't affect their sales really. But since they don't have budget issues, why aren't they localizing their games? What is the obstacle that is stopping from them localizing their games? That's not an obstacle. In an international conference I joined, a major publisher, I don't want to name them, I talked about it to them, and I asked, why aren't you localizing your game to Turkish? Well, they said, we're not against Turkish in particular, but the market isn't meeting our demands, because let's say the game has 2 million words, the cost and the return of investment isn't enough in Turkish markets. So every language means another risk for developers, for publishers. It's the same for us. We have been in this industry for years, but with every single game, hey, we are starting over again. What issues are we facing? But even if you are a major company, they ask themselves, will I get a return from my investments? Also, as I mentioned in JLT screen, every new language brings about new issues. So who's going to translate to different languages? Are you going to establish a community in the target language, a target community? So if they're not only thinking about the translation part of it, but the overall community part of the translation. We have all pirated games, and in the past when Steam wasn't as popular. You see, Modern Warfare 2 came out and it's 1,200 liras. It's so expensive. It is really expensive and it doesn't sell that much here. And a lot of people crack it. A lot of people pirate it. When I said 1,200 liras, I forgot what I was about to say. The prices are really high right now. Any other questions? I cannot hear the question. I'm going to give you a recent example. Chinese is one of the languages we translated the game into, but they said we want this text transcribed in Chinese alphabet. We said, okay, we can do that, and that's a strategy. We call this localization part of the process. We want this text to be almost as if it's written in Chinese. Some games are focused on globalization, but we want the game to be felt as if it was produced in the region itself. In, let's say, in the Arabic, you have to do it in Arabic letters, characters. But if your game is extremely known, for example, your Rockstar games, you don't really need to localize your game to every single region, because if you don't know Rockstar games, it's your fault. For smaller indie games, in localization projects, instead of working with agencies or with teams, can you just work with freelancers? Would that make sense? All I can say is, if that person knows your game well and you're sure about it, well, that makes sense in terms of budget and accessibility. Well, I was a freelancer once, but I'm now in the business aspect of localization. But if you're working with somebody untrustable, maybe he will stop translating your game. He could mistranslate your game. And if you can't be sure about that, that's a risky step. But if you can establish your own translation companies, you wouldn't have such issues. So in terms of localization, you should work with professional companies, because they will localize everything: your web page, your application, your game. You say, hey, I want this game in these 3 languages, and they will just translate the text for you. But what happens is, in these 3 languages, some parts of the translation could be good, some parts of the translation could be bad. But let's say the game is Japanese, but you don't feel it's a good translation. There is no flow in the translation. So what the companies do is they work with the same team, and let's say you have an RPG game and you give it to a certain company, so a certain agency to translate, and you also make them translate the game. You make them play the game, then you make them translate the game, because you have to understand the game first to be able to translate the game well. Because if they don't play your game, they just look at it as a text, and it won't be a nice translation. It would be just translation for translation's sake, and we don't really like that. But if you play the game, and if you understand the logic behind the game, and if you think to yourself, well, hey, well, I remember this one, well, I remember this feature of this character, then you can translate your text accordingly. And that depends on building the correct team. But let's give an example. If you have a certain player, well, I said there was a Turkish game, and you say, hey, I wanted to translate this game, and they give you some money for it, and I translated that game. But you have to meet with the correct person for that. Okay, I would like to add something. I'm going to say Bekir Hoca, because he is my teacher in university. So, everybody who speaks English cannot translate, right? So there's also this part of it. Everybody can't do every translation. So Bekir Hoca translated automotive text. I translated medical text. So even in a certain genre, you can translate everything. Bekir can translate sports games. I can translate FPS games. I have been freelancer for 4 years because I can translate MOBA games, because I don't know MOBA. I've never played them. I don't have I'm not an expert in that area. So you have to have specific knowledge or know-how in the area. So your translator knows the language, and it has played a game in a similar style to my game, or has translated a game similar to the style of my game. As Bekir mentioned, your translator or localizer must have knowledge about the genre of the game. When you work with a translation agency, they play the game first. So let's say you name something button. There are two different equivalents for Turkish. So if you have several translators, there can be inconsistencies in the translation. So, but if you work with an agency, there's consistency. They have played the game. They spend their working hours playing games. So you gather knowledge about the game, gather information about the game. So if you filter it well, you can use community interpreting or freelancer translators. Okay, I want to ask this. Have you ever had an offer in which you said, well, we can translate this game, we don't have an appropriate translator for this genre? And has that ever happened? That's happened, yes, of course. There was a game. The game had a lot of cultural objects in it, and had we said you should change the text, or we can translate it, because there are racist remarks in the game. We can't translate that. And also we do different translations as well. There was a translation for weapons. Well, I translate weapons in games, but I can't translate real weapons. So that's that. So the policies also affects, the humanitarian policies also affect our decisions. In the game that I played was racist against a certain country. It was made by the enemy country of the country that was being subjected to disrespect. So it was an RPG game. You go somewhere, you hit somewhere, you discover different regions. but we refused the translation, and the game wasn't translated afterwards because nobody accepted the localization project. Maybe this happened, and this is due to the sensitivity or our community. And everybody said this game is unnecessarily offensive. This is way too racist, and nobody accepted the project.
There was another game which was too pornographic and there were very heavy expressions in it. And we said, if we translate this into Turkish, you will have legal problems. So we rejected that game, that job as well. Let's say there's a Turkish saying, ataların üstüleri geçti. It doesn't exist in Portuguese. What do? In that case, we explain what that expression means, what it is trying to say in the simplest way possible. We say, for instance, this expression is used for these purposes in Turkish. This is what it means. And this is the message that we're trying to give to the user, to the player. And then we find a similar one. Or if they say this doesn't exist, there's nothing even similar to this in our language, we say, I'm in a rush. Let's say you have missed an opportunity. What do? What do you say? This expression means the ship has sailed in Turkish. What do you say in your language? Then we come up with something. This is why typical translation mistake happens. They translate it directly. The direct translation has a horse in it, and the target culture doesn't understand it. There is no horse in the game. So what does this mean? So such things do happen. This is about translating directly or experiencing translating the experience. I don't want to go into theory too much, but let's say there's a tribe in the poles and they write a poem. They say life is as boring as a fresh snow. That means it's familiar to them or ordinary. But when this is read by someone who lives in a desert, they will not understand it because they will say, what is a snow? Or how is a snow boring? But if the goal is to transfer the emotion, in this case, it is a game experience. In that case, our main focus is to translate the experience or the emotion. And then you have different tools. You can change some of the visuals. Or if it is backed by music, for instance, you can adapt it culturally. So we're eliminating borders there. The UI aspect is important for us as well, because in many localization companies, this is one of their most basic perspective. In this interface, what do we expect? What do we see? When you look at it as a regular text, you can find 100 different translators, but when it's a game, you say, okay, only 3 translators can do a good job here. Others can maybe perform in different types of games. So this is about specialization. And it takes, of course, years to get expertise in this. Let's say a game is musical. And when you're translating, you're actually composing in a different language. In some countries, for instance, Ice Age, let's say, ah bu hayat çekilmez, sen olmasan mamut. The mammoth is included into the translation, but this doesn't exist in every language probably. What do you do in this case? In game translation, voiceover is something that is avoided because it's very expensive. It starts at $10,000, even the beginning, just to say hi. It starts $10,000 and then you add new language and new cost. But when it comes to the music or without going into the composing, on the other side, in translation, we try to do this like with a stronger translation, transcreation, let's say, we try to do that. Of course, if the company has money, they can put us into cooperation and make us find a studio and find a dubber, a voiceover artist, a male or female voice, and create a brand new song. It can go all the way to the intellectual property. I have never had this. I hope I never will, because it will take a lot of time and effort. But in our domain, let's say, the most complicated request that I got was the countries are changing in the game and they wanted the music to change. And you have to find music in the new country. In this country, which instrument is more common? What type of music is more common? So you have to research, or you have to ask the team there, the local team. There are jingles, and we have to do this in a culture close to yours. So they research as well, and they say this is available, that is available, and you send it to the customer, and the customer chooses. It is very complicated, and this takes up more time than the language itself. This otherwise you would have to create new job lines. One more question, one more comment. 10 years ago, there was, for instance, no Russian. You could search civilians, but now we live in a much more sensitive environment. There was a game, there was a variable in the game, X killed Y, let's say, but they only used himself. It's an online game. That would mean only men are killed in the game. If it was launched that way, that would be problematic, and they would get a lot of objection. So you have to be sensitive. For instance, imagine the jingle for Turkey. Let's say they chose something like Arabic, like camels are passing by. In that case, the Turkish users would react. This happened, by the way. Yes, so we have to have the same level of accuracy when we're going out of Turkish to other languages. I have to interrupt you, by the way. This brought us to the end of our time. We have to start the next panel in 5 minutes. Thank you very much for your questions. Thank you very much for participating.